Okay, our first speaker in this morning's session is Sofia Carozza, and she is a Marshall Scholar and a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. She is she just submitted her PhD, so she'll be Dr. Carozza pretty soon. And she is going to be starting a postdoc at Harvard in the next couple months. She's done research on the impact of early adversity on brain development. She completed her undergraduate studies in neuroscience and theology at the University of Notre Dame. She graduated as the valedictorian at Notre Dame of the class of 2019. And her talk is The Promise and Pitfalls of Integrating Neuroscience and Faith.
Thank you. And it's a real delight to be here with you today to talk to you a little bit about the promise and pitfalls of integrating neuroscience and faith. Francis Crick, who, as most of you will know, is the co-discoverer of the helical structure of DNA, once wrote, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are, in fact, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." While Crick deliberately phrased this, I think, in a provocative manner, he was far from alone in this belief, and this remains the case 30 years later. Both within the field of neuroscience and in the public imagination, neuroscience is often posited as a complete and transparent picture into the ground truth of reality. A logical conclusion of which is that we have no need for anything else, least of all, belief in God. To us neuroscientists, this strikes us as ludicrous, because we're all too aware of the limits of our field, limits in practice, but also in principle, that pretty narrowly circumscribe what the study of the structure and function of the human brain can tell us about reality. Maybe for this reason, I find that we tend to maintain a strict separation between neuroscience and faith, between insights that we have about the brain and our practice of the faith. Whilst this kind of separation might be more reasonable than the reductionism of Francis Crick, that's a bit of a low bar. And I think that keeping science and faith apart is not only unnecessary, but an impoverishment of our lives. Because reality is one, and truth cannot contradict itself. So our discoveries about the natural world can only complement and enrich what we know through faith. Nowhere, I would argue, is this promise more evident than in neuroscience, because the object of neuroscience is the structure and function of the human nervous system and its relationship to human behavior. In other words, it's the human person. Because while the human person certainly is not just an assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules, the human person is composed of both a soul and a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So faith and neuroscience can be mutually illuminating approaches to the human person. In fact, my claim today is that neuroscience can lead us into a deeper understanding of the origin and destiny of the human person. This is the promise. But there are also a number of pitfalls that lie in our way, common mistakes that can turn neuroscience into something that leads us away from God. For us to pursue mutual illumination instead, I think we need to follow a path of conversion, of metanoia, of changing our minds. So that is the structure of today's brief talk. First, I'll explore a few promising places of integration between neuroscience and faith. I'll outline a few main pitfalls that I see on the path. And then I'll conclude with a rule for the path ahead. Promise, pitfalls, and a rule. But before I begin, I should probably clarify the scope of today's talk. Neuroscience is a broad collection of very disparate subfields. In line with my expertise, I'm going to be focusing on systems and behavioral cognitive neuroscience. Secondly, I intend to explore integration not just with faith as a personal theological virtue, but also faith that seeks understanding, so with Catholic theology. I'm not going to explore how faith can improve neuroscience and neuroscientists, but that is a rich topic in and of itself. And finally, while neuroscience is relevant for important bioethical questions, perhaps especially beginning and end of life issues, I'm not going to be exploring those today. I'm more concerned with how neuroscience can help inform the theological anthropology of the average Catholic in the pew, and thus also their self-understanding. So to begin, what is the promise of integrating neuroscience and the faith? My answer is that neuroscience puts flesh and bones on our origin and destiny. It illuminates, in other words, the nature that the Creator has given us and the path to its realization or fulfillment. One particularly compelling articulation of that origin and destiny comes from Pope St. John Paul II and his Wednesday audiences that formed the basis of the theology of the body. The Pope began his account from the second creation story of Genesis. There we read that God first created the man, then remarked that it is not good that the man should be alone, and so created the woman. As the Pope pointed out, the word for man here is a gender-neutral term that refers to all of humanity, not just males. So the aloneness of the human person, or original solitude, as he put it, is a description of the very nature of the person. In other words, as persons, we find ourselves before God as if in search of our own entity, or we could say in modern terms, in search of an identity. In this position of original solitude, the Pope says that our awareness is defined by our embodiment. Man is created in the visible world precisely as a body among bodies. So we are self-conscious of our bodies and of the meaning of our bodies. This is what distinguishes us as human persons. And what is the meaning of the body? Well, Genesis ties it to tilling the ground. In other words, to the use of human freedom to engage in activity that expresses the person. This illustrates that man is created to be a partner of the absolute, inasmuch as he must consciously discern and choose between good and evil, between life and death. In other words, through acting in the body, through using our freedom, we're able to determine ourselves. We can transcend material and biological determinants of our being and collaborate with the work of the Creator. Because of our self-consciousness and our self-determination, these two features of our original solitude, the Pope says that in all its materiality, the body is almost penetrable and transparent, in such a way as to make it clear who man is and who he should be. In other words, God has created us to be his collaborators. Through the body, we participate in his ongoing act of creation. And so we can choose to become either the heavenly creature that he created us to be, or the hellish creature, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis. As Judas did, the Gospels say that he became a traitor. He became one through repeated choice of evil, through the repeated choice of death. He became one who, the kind of creature that Dante could aptly depict as frozen in the mouth of Satan in the bottom of hell. Because our self-determination, our choice of good or evil, operates through and is inscribed in our materiality. Neuroscience here, I think, can provide evidence for or against the scope of this claim. It can reveal to us how far this insight of Pope St. John Paul II extends. In other words, where do we see self-determination in the body? The answer I would like to provide to this is the fact of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change over time. The structure and function of the brain are not set in stone, but are plastic, malleable across the lifespan. As we traverse scales from a single neuron to systems and domains from lower order capacities like vision to higher ones like abstract thinking, the extent of neuroplasticity varies, as can the biological mechanisms involved. One particular mechanism is myelination. This is when glial cells wrap their membranes around the axons of neurons to create myelin, a sheath of fatty insulation. Myelin accelerates neuronal conduction and generally makes communication more efficient. Myelin, over the course of childhood, begins to cover the major white matter pathways of the brain and turns them into consolidated circuits that can support things like goal-directed behavior, emotional regulation, abstract thinking, and more. For effective circuits to form, then, glial cells have to target the right neurons with myelin. And how do they decide which to myelinate? Through the activity of the neurons themselves. In other words, glial cells turn the neural pathways that we use into stronger, more established neural circuits. And contrary to what neuroscientists thought for decades, myelin is not static once it's there. It's dynamic. Over the course of life, as we learn new skills and pick up new behaviors, the underlying neural circuits gain myelin to support this activity, whereas those behaviors that we abandon, the circuits that support those, can lose their myelin and become vulnerable to atrophy. So if you repeatedly choose, for example, to consume pornography, Your brain will change to make communication in the underlying neural circuit quicker and more efficient, and you will have made yourself into a more lustful person. Thus, we see in the white matter architecture of the human brain John Paul II's principle of self-determination. The choice of a particular sin makes us biologically more of that kind of a sinner, and a transparent and complete picture of our neural circuitry, were that possible, would make it clear that this is who we are, whereas the choice of a virtue shapes the biological substrates of our virtuous behavior. We align our physical being more closely with our destiny. If you're interested in the philosophy and neuroscience of self-determination, I recommend this excellent paper by Daniel Dehaan, who's at Oxford. But time is racing on, so I'm going to turn now to a second place where we see the promise of integrating neuroscience and faith. I think a cursory look at self-determination, like the one that we've just taken, could leave us with a false impression of the principle. We could take self-determination to be a kind of self-creation and misunderstand freedom to be an unencumbered capacity for autonomous choice, which is a misunderstanding I think that our contemporary culture certainly encourages. But anyone who's experienced a single day of human life will know that this is not the structure of our existence. We are not autonomous self-creators. We are weak and limited. And I find there's a strong temptation to rebel against this, that we're tempted to view our weakness as categorically problematic, as merely a manifestation of our fallen nature. So we strive with all our might to free ourselves from this weakness. But I think this is a lie of Western individualism. Our limitations are not inherently sinful. On the contrary, they're part of the original structure of our being, which God proclaimed to be good, very good. Our weakness, in a sense, is willed by God, and thus is something to embrace. Neuroscience, here's my second claim, neuroscience can help us see the goodness of our dependence. It can help us characterize the difference between self-determination on the one hand and self-creation on the other, and thus free us from the lie of individualism. And the primary place I see this is in developmental neuroscience, in the study of the emergence of the structure and function of the human brain across childhood. Because the developing brain is a fundamentally relational organ. In other words, the primary driver of brain development is loving relationship. Any biologists or epidemiologists in the room might be squirming in their seats, thinking of all the critical genetic contributors to child development. And of course, this is true. Both nature and nurture help form the initial scaffold of the brain. And nature, or genetics, does seem to dominate during the embryonic period. Genes govern the birth of neurons, their maturation, their migration, the formation of their preliminary connections with one another. However, even these earliest stages of brain development depend on the context of the mother's body. The mother's experiences and choices and love reach the child through her immune system, her hormones, the microbiome, and epigenetics, each of which can change the course of embryonic development and thus the child's life. So in other words, even nature involves nurture. This interpersonal dependence of the brain only increases as the child grows and enters the world. For once this initial scaffold of the brain has developed, a new phase of neural development begins, in which it's experience that drives the maturation of the nervous system. How is this possible? Well, as I mentioned before, neural activity determines whether a given structural connection is kept and strengthened or eliminated through mechanisms of neuroplasticity like myelination. So this means that a child's embodied experiences have a crucial directive role. They direct the refinement of her brain networks. And where do children receive this early sensory experience? We have an example standing in the back. Through interactions with their caregivers, through loving exchanges with their parents, through gazing at one another, babbling back and forth, through touch and smiles and play. These interactions evoke patterns of neural activity that shape the structure of the child's brain and the cognitive functions that it's going to support across the rest of the lifespan. And indeed, there's a growing and exciting body of research that's tying the quality of parent-infant interactions to a whole host of structural and functional differences across the lifespan. And as Ruth Feldman, among others, has noted, this developmental history or etiology of the brain means that for all of us, throughout our lives, our nervous system expects to be in a social context of love. It depends upon relationships for self-regulation and to properly support our psychological capacities, including memory, attention, emotion, you name it. The brain is a relational organ that never outgrows its dependence. So what do we see in this? Well, let's return to Pope St. John Paul II. The body is almost penetrable and transparent in such a way as to make it clear who man is and who he should be. The development of the brain reflects who we are and who we should be, namely that we're made in and through and for a communion of love. Because to use the words of the first creation of Genesis, narrative of Genesis, God made us in his image and likeness, and God has revealed himself to be Trinity. His life is a unity of three persons in love. It's the overflowing of this self-gift. So to flourish as a human being does not mean to find independence or to achieve autonomy, but to become fully relational. And this is what heaven is going to be, perfect relationship. So to be most human here below, we must receive our life from another. And as the Pope reminds us, to find ourselves through a sincere gift of ourselves. These truths are inscribed in our neurobiology. So what are we to do? Faced with our capacity for self-determination on the one hand, and our call to become ourselves through relationships of love, what can move our freedom in that direction? What can animate this path of the Christian life? And I think the answer is simple: desire. This is the third place of integration that I will explore today. Desire, which is the animating force of all of human activity. Our search for and longing for human fulfillment guides us in every act, big or small. As Luigi Giussani writes, one phenomenon underlies the vibrant arc of human nature. It's the phenomenon of desire, which ultimately incarnates the profound attraction with which God calls us to himself. In other words, God has planted a longing for himself in our hearts. And our every act, the truth of every act, is a search for him, a search for goodness, for justice, for beauty. This is the greatness of the human person. And the radical truth of Christianity is that God became man to save our desire. The Word became flesh so that we might encounter a presence in the flesh that corresponds to what we yearn for and shows us what that desire is for. All of life is given to us to discover that the answer to our desires is Christ, to say yes to him, to learn to do this. This is why St. Augustine says that all of the Christian life is in fact an exercise in holy desire. Where can this path of desire begin? Where do we start from? Well, as the Dominican Conrad Pepler writes, it begins in the world of the senses. The human person first knows and desires what he sees and smells and tastes and touches. And from these he learns to look and desire beyond. He is not satisfied with what satisfies the body, but searches for something higher at the back of all his senses can know. This is exactly what we see in the brain. Desire is the animating principle of the function of the nervous system. At the lowest level, it's present in what Antonio Damasio has called homeostatic feelings, things like hunger, fatigue, fear, that structure and organize our neural activity. And you see this in things like, for example, the brainstem's regulation of our respiratory rates. This organizing role of desire, however, only becomes more apparent in evolutionarily more recent structures, and most prominently, I would argue, in the reward system, which is the set of neural pathways that undergird motivation, associative learning, and positive emotions, particularly through dopaminergic signaling, dopamine. In other words, this system undergirds our learning of and our pursuit of the objects of our desire. And in fact, if this system is knocked out in mice, they stop eating completely. They'll literally starve to death in the laboratory. Importantly, in humans, reciprocal connections between this system and the frontal cortex mediates integration with higher order judgments and beliefs and enables top-down regulation of our pursuit of the objects of our desires. If these reciprocal connections with the frontal cortex are lost, for example, through neurodegeneration, patients show complete apathy. They lose the will to live, or to act, sorry. It might even play a fundamental part in consciousness itself. We see this in patients with a neurological condition called athyormia, which is a disorder of the reward system. Those afflicted by this condition report that they've lost their mental life, almost as if their mind has just gone completely blank. And I'm indebted to physician and ethicist Bill Hurlbut for bringing this to my attention, because I think it profoundly illustrates the central place of desire in all of human life. Of course, I'm not saying that desire is localized to this circuit or to any part of the brain. Rather, that the brain reflects that human activity is a function of human desire, and that this is plastic. In other words, that we learn through our experiences what to desire and how to align our behavior with the truth of our desires. And I think this is a potentially very fruitful place of integration between neuroscience and faith, because our culture is suffering from a profound crisis of desire. Our desire is mediated. It passes through models. It's what René Girard called mimetic. We depend upon others to understand what's worth wanting. And our culture is devoid of the proclamation that our desire, in the end, is for the infinite. It's for God. It's for a perfect happiness, a complete justice, infinite goodness. And so nothing that you can cultivate on social media or purchase on Amazon, or that can be achieved by a political party. Faced with this poverty of models of desire, I think we have a task as Christians to help the Lord through the Gospels and the church to perform what David Ford has called a rehabilitation of human desire. And I think that drawing on neuroscience can help us in this endeavor. It can help us articulate the role of desire in human life. So what's the promise of integrating neuroscience and faith? I've claimed today that it can bring us to a deeper understanding of the origin and destiny of the human person and the eternal love of God, and what can bring us along that path. Of course, there are countless practical applications of this integration, this higher level theoretical integration. A few promising places could be in Catholic social teaching, in our understanding of prayer, the sacraments, and I'm happy to talk to you over the break or at lunch about any number of these things. But the overarching theme of integration is that neuroscience enriches and complements what we know through faith. It puts flesh and bones on, but does not contradict what we believe. This is unfortunately a rare perspective. The dominant narrative when it comes to neuroscience and faith is of a materialism triumphant. It's that neuroscience has extended our deterministic explanations of the universe into the person herself, into human subjectivity. So any transcendent reality, including the self or God, is an illusion, and faith is merely an evolutionarily adaptive pattern of brain activity. I won't critique these kinds of claims in detail right now, because quite frankly, I find them tedious. Instead, I'm going to point out a few common threads that run through them all, a few pitfalls that can turn neuroscience into something that competes with the faith. All of them involve a distortion of neuroscience. In other words, the primary dangers that I see as we attempt to integrate neuroscience and faith come from an incomplete or inaccurate view of the discipline of neuroscience. The first pitfall is misunderstanding of its scope. Neuroscience is the study of the structure and function of the human brain and its relationship to human behavior. This is a very limited scope. If we were to analyze it according to Aristotle's account of causation, we could say that neuroscientific explanations can certainly offer material causes, that out of which a thing is composed. So for example, if we're considering visual processing, it can tell you it's composed of neural activity from the retina to the cortex. It might also be able to specify an efficient cause, the agent that causes this operation to take place. Again, in this case, we could say it's the perception of a visual stimulus. Neuroscience might even posit a final cause, what the operation is for, by drawing on evolutionary biology. But it cannot come near a formal cause, why something is the case or what its essence is. This is irreducible to the measurable quantities that neuroscience can study. And neuroscientists, even very serious and competent ones, they often miss this. They claim to give a full explanation of the phenomenon they're interested in, when in reality, they've just avoided the need to give a formal cause by reducing it to a lower level of the brain. So for example, they avoid having to say what fear is or to acknowledge that fear is something by just saying it's the activity of the amygdala, which is not only bad neuroscience, it's also the mereological fallacy, which is the ascription of some capacity of the human person to part of the person. It's a fallacy to ascribe fear to the amygdala, just as it's a fallacy to ascribe the experience of God to a neural circuit. These are experiences of the person. Of course, neuroscience can tell us something about fear and about the embodied experience of God, because we're not substance dualists. but is limited to the first two, maybe three kinds of cause. Implicit in this point is that neuroscience studies depend on higher level disciplines for the concepts that they operationalize. One of the places I see this most prominently is in studies of free will. The definition of free will that a researcher has shapes how this neuroscientist designs his or her study and interprets the results. And this means that they can do that inadequately or wrongly. I'd argue that a lot of neuroscience studies of free will aren't studies of free will at all, but studies of the feeling of an urge to perform a motor action. Neuroscience alone cannot give you the definition. So the first pitfall is misunderstanding the scope of neuroscience, falsely believing that neuroscience gives us an exhaustive account of reality. The second pitfall is ignorance of the methodological limits of neuroscience, and there are many. Some of these are accidental, only in practice, and may diminish over time. So for example, there are numerous layers of inference that lie between the readout of a functional MRI scan and our conclusions about the underlying neural activity. Few people seem to realize that an fMRI scan does not directly indicate mass neural firing. Even fewer seem to realize that it doesn't even directly indicate blood flow. It measures changes in the magnetic properties of blood. Relatedly, most of our analysis pipelines offer countless forking paths. In other words, our methods are flexible in a way that allows thousands of different results to come out of the same data set. This is the flexibility that allowed researchers to detect brain activity in a dead salmon. I would highly recommend this paper. Methodological limits like these, and our ignorance of them, I think account for the barrenness of much of neuroscience. But beyond these practical limits and methods, neuroscience is essentially limited in its method in the fact that it takes place through the subjectivity of the investigator. Far from a transparent and independent window into the ground truth of reality, science is essentially personal. And here I will refer you to the masterful work of Michael Polanyi, Personal Knowledge. He convincingly argues in this that any attempt to systematically eliminate our human perspective from our picture of the world must lead to absurdity, because knowledge is personal. Now, this doesn't condemn us to relativism, because our intellect can establish contact with reality. But it does mean that neuroscience, and science in general, doesn't advance through proofs and certainties, but through falsifying our best explanations and replacing them with better ones. Without awareness of the methodological limits of neuroscience, whether practical or in principle, we ascribe excessive confidence to the results of neuroscience studies and to the interpretations that neuroscientists themselves make of them. Finally, the third pitfall that I'd like to propose is immorality. Every neuroscientist and consumer of neuroscience, as a human being, is marked by original sin. In other words, we experience the temptation to put the love of truth after our love of ourselves. We're tempted to be more attached to our career, our favorite theory, or simply our convenience than we are to the truth of reality. I think this is an underappreciated limitation in science and a critical contributor to the replication crisis, which is the realization that we've had over the last few decades that many published research findings are false. Because faced with a flexible analysis plan and an impending 10-year review, it's perhaps easier to draw results out of your data that cohere with your theory and then interpret them in the strongest possible light than it is to seek the truth and articulate it with humility. And a neuroscience that reflects our ideas about reality instead of the truth is of no use to the faith. But the need for morality doesn't end there, because everyone who works to integrate neuroscience and faith is similarly marked by original sin, and thus also experiences the temptation to love their ideas more than they love the truth, which in this context can take shape as the temptation to go on a fishing expedition, hunting for facts about the brain that we can strip from their context and put in the service of proselytizing, whether it's in preaching the gospel or preaching atheist materialism. Why is it important to know the limits of neuroscience? Limits in scope, limits in method, limits in morality. Because an inadequate understanding of the limits of neuroscience leads us to give the field a priority and an authority in explaining reality that it does not deserve. This damages our practice of the science itself, and it damages our culture, certainly, but it especially is harmful when we seek to integrate neuroscience and faith. As Stanley Jackie wrote, whenever a philosopher or theologian yields the fraction of a hair's breadth on the intrinsic limitation of exact science, he runs the grave risk of the heedless boy who put his hand through the fence of the lion's cage, or I would say the mistake of Icarus, who had a good desire to reach the sun, but chose a method that could not accomplish that end. The risk is that of a potential tragedy, the tragedy being a condemnation to a bleak existence that is completely emptied out of meaning, reduced to meaningless biological mechanisms. So what do? How can we avoid this tragedy? Well, I have already exhausted my time, so I will only leave you with a brief rule to follow. We must respect the unity of reality. In science itself and in our work of integration, we must respect the unity of reality. This includes the unity of knowledge. So first, even before we begin on this project of integration, neuroscience itself already depends upon philosophical concepts and assumptions. What does it mean to be a human person? What is health? What is the mind? How do we know? These questions only philosophy can adjudicate, but they determine the success of neuroscience. So embracing our dependence on philosophy is not just a responsibility, but an opportunity for us. And here I'd propose Thomism and phenomenology as possibly the two philosophical traditions that are most potentially fruitful when it comes to integration with neuroscience. And secondly, respecting the unity of knowledge means respecting that neuroscience is subordinate to theology. This is because theology begins from first principles that are revealed by God, whereas neuroscience depends upon the observations and manipulations of reality that our very limited powers can do. And I think this calls for humility and obedience amongst scientists who desire to integrate insights about the brain with the faith. But I would like to take us one step further. The unity of reality demands not only that we pursue harmony across disciplines, but that we live a unified life. Because the fact that reality is one means that my life is one, that I am one. I'm not one person while I'm praying or going to mass or reading theology, and another whilst I'm in the laboratory. I think secularism encourages us to live highly fragmented lives, pursuing different ends in these different contexts. But the disunity of reality is a myth. All things exist in and for Christ. He holds all of creation together in himself. So my life is one, my heart is one, and the truth of my every action is a search for him. I think this is a tremendous source of freedom for us scientists, because we don't have to censor anything. Faced with the magnificent complexity of the human brain, we can allow ourselves to be moved in wonder to praise of the Creator, or faced with the crosses of tedious analyses or failed studies, we can suffer with our Savior, because all of our reality is a chance to be in dialogue with him. And I think this unity of life is a necessary foundation for a fruitful work to integrate neuroscience and faith. Because beginning from the experience of a unified life, rather than a theory about the world, re-enchants our gaze on reality. It fills us with the awareness of his presence in everything and a desire to discover this presence and communicate it to others. And so, rooted in the unity of our lives, we can pursue an integration of neuroscience and faith that can bring glory to God. Thank you.
So we have time here for two questions, like one here and one over there.
So I was intrigued by your comment about plasticity of the brain and choosing self. Is there any neurological or neuroscience evidence kind of linking use of violent apps or violent games to violent behavior? I know there's a lot of epidemiologic sense, but I guess the question is there a reasonable hypothesis that some kids, young people, are more prone to reinforcement of those? And I'm not interested in the ethics. Is there any science on it?
There is science on it. The question is whether it's reliable science. I find that a lot of studies of the impact of technology and media use on child development are coming out of laboratories that either because of their funding or because of their theories come into it already with an idea in mind. So I find it hard to draw strong conclusions in either direction, because there are studies showing that the use of violent video games does increase aggressive behavior in adolescents, and studies that don't find any evidence for that. So I think the jury is still out. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea either way, but we're still waiting for robust scientific evidence of that fact.
Thank you, Sophia. Many questions, but in view of time, the most pressing one for me is the emergence of AI and how to deal with that, promises and pitfalls with regards to our human mind, and especially the collective mind of humanity.
Mm. Thank you. I'm certain that there are people in this room who have more informed and mature thoughts on this topic than I do, so perhaps we can have a conversation later. But yeah, I think it's a remarkably exciting prospect, because artificial intelligence is imitation of human intelligence. And so in a sense, it's a way to get to know ourselves better. Now, whether or not it's really advanced to that point is a question, in part because it completely neglects sort of the embodied and enacted aspect of human intelligence. But the application of these technologies to all sorts of questions of relevance for human flourishing is really exciting. And I'm very far from being someone who's fearful of the prospect of it, taking over the world. Now, the ethics of artificial intelligence certainly needs a lot more work and attention, and I think we have a responsibility here to be proactive in leading that development. But no, I'm very excited about what it can help us learn about intelligence and the nature of knowing.
How would you describe a feature like desire as something that is embedded in the brain, or in the brain and the body? And how would you describe the relationship between the two, as a top-down or a systemic relation?
Sorry, between the relationship between desire and...
Between the brain and the body, a feature like desire, and how would you characterize that in terms of its relationship between the brain and body? And would you describe that relationship as being top-down or systemic?
Top-down or systemic? I'd probably say desire is both top-down and systemic when it comes to how it's manifest in the brain and the body. I think if we think of the soul generally as the form of the body, that it's not sort of a separable alternative substance, and so we don't have desire or a feature of the soul somewhere out there having sort of a causal top-down impact on our embodied being, but that it's something that organizes, structures, and directs and gives meaning to the body itself. And so it's present within our materiality. That doesn't mean it's reducible to materiality, but does mean it's not, a ghost in the machine sort of influencing us. Oh, brain and body, certainly. Yeah, brain and body. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, thank you,
Thanks.
Sophia, again, for a wonderful talk.